Nearly a year ago, I decided to make a video covering one of the most beloved and certainly one of my favourite point and click adventure games, Broken Sword. The series has certainly seen its fair share across the years, continuing to have released despite the decline of point and click adventure games, adapting to meet new 3D trends in the early 2000s. However, before that, Revolution Software released a sequel to its hit game in 1997, 1 year after Broken Sword: The Shadow of the Templar. Broken Sword 2: The Smoking Mirror. Much like the first game, Broken Sword 2 received a re-release over a decade later in 2010. Both remasters introduced updated graphics and music to be improved. Although unlike Shadow of the Templar's director cut, the Broken Sword 2 remaster featured no changes to the story or any inclusions. Now, if you've watched my video on Broken Sword's director's cut, you'll probably see that I am not particularly keen on the changes made to the game, such as the outright removal of deaths from the game. As a result, the main topic of the conversation for that video was, how does the remake compare to the original? And when I started recording the footage for the games, that was initially the intended comparison I wanted to convey for the sequel, until I played both versions and made a realisation. The remaster for Broken Sword 2 was actually pretty good. Why? Because it was a faithful remaster. Rather than make cuts, such as removing some of the more graphic scenes, adding in some filler puzzles, like sliding puzzles, or removing methods of dying, Revolution Software instead learned from its mistakes, and it doesn't look like anything was altered aside from the inclusion of boxes depicting the characters and some updated music. Everything else seemed untouched, deaths and all. And believe me, I checked. I sat around in the spider room for a long time, and I can confirm the remaster scarred me just as much as the original did. With the realisation, the question of whether the remaster lived up to the shadow of the original game was no longer in play. Instead, it made me start questioning, how did the sequel live up to its original counterpart? So instead, today we're talking about just how does the sequel hold up to the original. One of the frequent comparisons I often see are people comparing the original Broken Sword to Renaissance Disney, and I think that's pretty fair. The original cutscenes of Broken Sword are some of my favourites in video games, and that opening across France still sends chills down my spine to this day. As long as you played the original version, of course. Sorry, I'm still bitter. However, the comparison of Broken Sword to Renaissance Disney intrigued me. So I'd like to take that comparison and expand upon it. Now, many of the Renaissance Disney movies found themselves performing well in the cinema with significantly high budgets. So let's consider movies like The Little Mermaid and The Lion King, two of the most popular movies released during this period. With relation to the success of the movies, Disney made sequels, but rather than release them on the big screen, instead opted for releasing them as what we refer to as direct-to-video sequels. Whereas the original movie is often hailed significantly well and received a higher polish and budget, often you rarely hear people discuss the sequels. When we speak about Renaissance Disney, nobody is out there like, oh yeah, remember The Little Mermaid 2, Electric Eel Boogaloo? To me, this is what Broken Sword 2 is, at least compared to the original. I think that the original is the true gem, the diamond in the rough. Get it? Aladdin reference? But there's something I want to make clear. The comparison to a direct-to-video sequel by Disney is not a bad thing at all. I think a lot of those direct-to-video sequels are pretty damn good. But there is something to those sequels that feels a little different to the original, and that's honestly how I compare Broken Sword 2: The Smoking Mirror. Is Broken Sword 2 a good game? Yeah. But is it as good as the original Broken Sword? No. So let's look into the game itself. The game opens with George reuniting with Nico in Paris, where he comes along with her to check out a stone with Professor Ubier. However, in typical George fashion, such a trip nearly results in his impending doom, with George being bonked on the head by the man who lets them in, who then proceeds to kidnap Nico, tie up George and release a spider, then proceeds to start a fire. Now, of all the ways to kill somebody, this seems the most convoluted. If you want to kill a guy, you don't go to the effort of catching a deadly spider in Central America, smuggle it into another country, and then proceed to release it in a room of fire. You just shoot the guy. But hey, it builds suspense. The gameplay for Broken Sword 2 is exactly the same as the original game. George interacts with the environment by picking up items, using them on others, and, on a few occasions, squishing some spiders. Neat. The introduction to the game allows the player to move around in a confined area to get to know the methods of how to play, including handling the spider by knocking the bookcase over using the game's hotspots and freeing George. After discovering some clues, including a museum and an old friend, George is able to head out and explore. Exploration in Broken Sword 2 is a lot more linear compared to the original game, which allowed the player to travel to multiple locations on a map. While the entire bulk of Broken Sword 1 is a mystery game, there is still a sense of exploration, of tourism. However, Broken Sword 2 throws away that touristy approach like a cheap disposable camera and streamlines things, only truly offering choice of where to go at the start of the game in France, with everything else essentially following on rails. However, interactions still occur much like they did in the first game, with many different interactable characters. But unfortunately for those characters, I'm not really sure any really stand out. In Broken Sword 1, there were a few standout characters such as Maguire, Utar, Nejo. Broken Sword 2, however, doesn't particularly have as many memorable characters. In fact, some of them might be considered to just, well, stink. As a result, Broken Sword 2 feels a lot less open as the first game, with most of the locations not being revisited after first entering. It also makes it a bit more difficult to overlook items that will be required later in the game. For example, at one point, George can enter a room and free Nico, and then attempt to leave without picking up a nearby fetish, only for George to automatically turn around and decide to pick up this item without prompt. This is because of the on-the-rail feeling of proceeding through the story and locations of Broken Sword. While the first game would often allow the player to revisit some locations, there is not much of that in Broken Sword 2. So if they did not pick up the needed item, this would result in what is known as a dead end, or dead man walking scenario for those versed in adventure games, particularly for those of the Sierra variety. However, Broken Sword 1 and 2 were considered to be a lot more fair compared to the Sierra games of the time, and instead wouldn't let the player proceed without the necessary items. Sure, you could die if you weren't careful, but as long as you saved frequently, you wouldn't particularly run the risk of messing up the game and restarting again. However, these feel a bit awkward compared to some of the more organic ways of gathering items. Also, funnily enough, George certainly worries more about leaving the room without a fetish, but has no qualms about leaving his girlfriend tied up in a room. Perhaps that's his fetish? Despite returning to France, a lot of the locations previously explored aren't seen, such as the cafe where it all started, or even Nico's apartment. However, the cafe at Montfaucon makes a return, as well as the police officer and Andre Lobineau, who acts as George's rival for Nico's affection. Or something. How? By buying Nico underwear. Phew. Using his help, George manages to locate where Nico is being kept and rescues her, finding that Nico was investigating a drug smuggler known as Karzak, but came to be kidnapped when she stumbled across a Mayan stone instead. After France, the story takes us to Quaramonte, in Central America, where George and Nico both find themselves looking into Karzak and his attempts to receive the stone. As they explore, they meet some friendly characters such as Dwayne and Pearl Henderson from the first game, and a talking goat.
What was that? It's a lump of lucky coal. Coal? I would have preferred chocolate. Any flavor, so long as it hasn't got marzipan in it. God, I hate marzipan.
While also introducing us to Raoul and his mother, who act as antagonists in the game. It also introduces us to controlling Nico, which is something new to the series before Broken Sword 1's remaster came out. Eventually, after making a daring prison escape, Nico and George set sail and are attacked by an attack helicopter, causing the boat to capsize and the two to wash up on shore, with Nico contracting a deadly poison. That seems a little excessive. But with the help of a priest, George visits a tribe nearby to receive a root to combat the poison, while also learning more about the Mayan stones and the two other stones that can be located in the Caribbean and in London. With Nico's health restored, the two split up, with George heading off for the sunny Caribbean and Nico heading off to Brit. The game at this point splits off into different parts, with players going back and forth between Nico and George. George's adventures in the Caribbean are a bit more chilled, although feature a bit more open areas and puzzles compared to Nico's path, which is less open but dangerous, with some action scenes. At the end of both sequences, the player receives a respective Mayan stone and heads back to Central America to give it back to the shaman. In what can be considered some pretty interesting gameplay, Broken Sword 2 actually allows multiple solutions to some puzzles. Take for example George's adventures in the Caribbean. On Ketch Island, George speaks with a fishing kid and asks him to catch him a fish, to which the kid asks him for some bait. In order to do this, George needs to give him a tequila worm from back at Professor Rubier's mansion. However, unlike most items in the game, George doesn't need to pick up this item, and if he doesn't have the worm, he can instead give the boy Nico's lipstick, which does need to be picked up. Another example is on Zombie Island. Zombie Island is home to some pretty nefariously difficult to traverse swamps. How difficult? Well, I tried to complete the swamp and gave up. However, there instead exists an alternative way to bypass this bullshittery, and that's by gaining the assistance of one rather cheesed off boar. In order to adventure, George needs to shoot the boar with a dart, which causes it to rush off in its direction. Now there is a pretty obvious branch for the player to click on that allows George to evade the boar, and for it to run off in the back and open a side path, leading directly to where George needs to be. If, however, the player has the clicking reflexes of an arthritic grandmother, then the boar instead runs off in another direction, meaning that the player will not be able to utilise the shortcut and will instead need to explore the swamps. Now sure, Broken Sword might not have dead ends like a Sierra game, but with how asinine the maze is, it might as well be. Nico's journey instead features some of the more darker environments, as she finds that the stone is stolen by Professor Rubier and tracks it down to where Karzak is, who in expert villain trope mannerisms proceeds to kill Ubier. Now gee, that's unfortunate. It's almost as if working for the insane drug lord bent on summoning an ancient Mayan god was a bad idea or something. It's when Nico returns back to the Mayan village that she finds that it has been razed to the ground and finds Titipoco, who tells her that George has been kidnapped and is ready to be sacrificed. The two head off to a Mayan pyramid and prevent the sacrifice and run into the pyramid, leading into the final moments of Broken Sword 2. And unfortunately, the ending to Broken Sword 2 is where the game begins to fall flat on its face, with the finale of the game not being nearly as daring and thrilling as the original. In fact, the finale of the game is essentially solving a large puzzle as Nico and then solving a door puzzle as George. Now let's recap. In Broken Sword 2, you travel atop a train, narrowly avoid death from a zealous group of Templars, and end the game by throwing a handbag of dynamite which blows up a castle. The finale of Broken Sword is filled with daring, danger and death. Let's be honest, this rules. Now let's look at the ending to Broken Sword 2. There's not exactly anything the player does to thwart the villain as a form of endgame challenge at this point. There are no thrills. The ending where you're supposed to stop a drug lord from summoning a literal god that you've heard all throughout the game is somehow the most boring part of the game, as you tiresomely pick away at a rather loathsome Mayan puzzle. Or, if you're like me, flashing your tatas at the Mayan puzzle to bypass it.
Wiggle. Et voilà!
Meanwhile, George's portion of the ending involves opening and closing several doors and walking downstairs. That's it, the game is won. The entire confrontation with the fearsome can't even say his name. The entire confrontation with the fearsome Tezcatlipoca is not actually interactive. Instead, this entirely occurs as merely a final cutscene where we see Karzak summon Tezcatlipoca, only for him to be cut down by the deity. Now gee, that's unfortunate. It's almost as if summoning an ancient Mayan version of Skeletor was a bad idea or something. Fortunately, George, Nico, Titipaco, and the now turned General Raoul happen to have the stones needed to lock the bad guy away, and the game is won by certain stones. And that's Broken Sword 2: The Smoking Mirror. As far as games go, sure, it's a pretty enjoyable experience, but unfortunately pales in comparison to its predecessor. However, I'd like to believe that this is still a decent game, although it absolutely should not and cannot be considered on the same level as the intricate and wondrous designs of the original Broken Sword game. Want to make sure you don't miss out on the video for Broken Sword: The Sleeping Dragon when it's released? Then make sure you don't forget to subscribe to Noir Reservoir and click that little bell down there to be kept up to date on all future Noir Reservoir videos. Likes and comments are always appreciated too. So until next time my friends, I'll catch you later.